Hi, this is Steve Michelotti of the Azure Government Engineering Team. I'm joined here today by Jason Henderson, Cloud Architect of Microsoft Federal, and we are here today to talk about secure Azure computing architecture for the DoD on Azure Government. So, we better start out by just having you help us understand what is the secure Azure computing architecture.
Yeah, so in order to kind of explain what the secure Azure computing architecture, as we like to call SACA, is, first we should probably talk about what the policy is that this is sort of trying to meet for the Department of Defense. So I'm going to talk to you guys real quick about the Secure Cloud Computing Architecture Functional Requirements document that was published by the Defense Information Systems Agency that essentially governs all information operations throughout the DoD. What they call SCCA FRD essentially outlines all the security policies that need to be met in order to connect to a commercial cloud provider such as Azure, right? This policy has four functional components of it. It's first one they call the boundary cloud access point, and this boundary cloud access point is essentially boundary protection, traditional IP filtering, and things like that. Sits in between the DoD's on-premises network and the cloud, sort of like a connection point where that sits. Then they have the virtual data center security stack. This is where they're doing traditional data center full up security type controls from web application firewall, SSL break and inspect, and again, IP filtering, things like that. And then you've got the virtual data center managed services. This is essentially like shared services that any enterprise would have, such as like host-based security, Azure Active Directory functions, logging aggregation, things like that. That's where like a SIEM would sit. Then they have a business role. It's called the Trusted Cloud Credential Manager, and there's some technical controls that need to be met in order to enable that person to do their job. It's essentially identity and access management. So all of these different controls, and there's a bunch of them that make up these four different components, essentially need to be met somewhere in an architecture, essentially in between the DoD and the cloud provider. So as we were talking to customers about how they could meet these policies, myself and a colleague, Kyle Hoyer, that we worked on this with, decided it's probably good to kind of standardize sort of a reference architecture of how you would do this in the cloud.
Got it. So the SCCA is the policy, and so the SACA is sort of the implementation or the reference of that policy?
Right. So that's where SACA came about. So Secure Azure Computing Architecture, we essentially took it and took out the cloud part of this SCCA and called it Azure, because this is the SCCA deployment on Azure to meet this policy. And so we created this reference architecture. So what SACA is a SCCA compliant architecture deployed on Azure. We designed this using currently available IL5 Impact Level 5 services in Azure.
Okay.
And so that's really key to this. As most of our DoD customers are going to deploy at IL5, we wanted to make sure that they could use this in IL5.
And so, given the fact that recently Azure Government has had an expansion to the IL5 services, there's quite a bit of services you can use within the SACA.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So actually, when we first designed everything in our what we call version 1, V1, and into V2 that we're going to show you today, there was a lot of things like Azure Monitor or Security Center, things like that could be used to meet some of these controls that were available in IL4, but not necessarily IL5. But with the expansion of the IL5 into the Gov regions, that opens up the opportunity to be able to use some more of these services. And then also we've decided to do some automated template deployments of this. And essentially it's just a DMZ reference architecture. It's pretty standard, but it meets these policies.
So it almost sounds to me like a little bit more than just a reference architecture, because once you have your VNet set up, for example, if you provision a new VM, it just goes into that existing VNet, correct?
Yeah, so in the template we deploy essentially some subnets that you can drop in whatever other tools you want to bring in, and I'll show you in a little bit the VDMS section where you're going to do those shared services. There's not a whole lot deployed in the template for VDMS, because every customer is going to want to use different things to meet those shared services. But we deploy a subnet inside the VNet where you can just start dropping the VMs in, and as soon as you drop the VMs in, all the routing is taken care of to enable that it all goes through the virtual appliances and all that.
Got it. So the template sort of puts you into the initial pit of success, and then what about governance? Does Azure policy, how does that relate to this, if at all?
Yeah, so the governance piece of it with Azure policy and the coming blueprints for the DoD, these are things that can be deployed in conjunction with this template. So you can deploy this template and then also deploy an Azure policy that sort of locks down your environment, sets up that governance structure for your actual enterprise. It's not part of this template, but it's something that's sort of a follow-on that's also obviously here at Microsoft, we're working really heavily on making that as easy as possible.
So I think that's an important point. Not only is the template you're showing us today hugely important, but it's not done. Like, we can continue to expand on the functionality and make it even better as we get these other services onboarded into Azure Government.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, great.
So this is essentially a high level of what the architecture actually looks like. This is this little bit of a busy network architecture diagram, but what you see here is you see a VNet sitting in as sort of a hub VNet that has a bunch of different appliances. So you've got your express route gateway, you've got a management subnet that includes jump boxes to be able to manage your environment. And then you've got the Azure load balancers, which will load balance traffic across the VMs that in this scenario are 2 network virtual appliances. It could be more, scaling laterally and running in an active scenario. So the Azure standard load balancer, when that became a service that we could use in IL5, was huge for this, so that we could actually enable active appliances scaling laterally.
And I see it's not just for VMs. We can use higher level PaaS services with like app services with the app service environment and that sort of thing.
Yep, absolutely. So the idea is that the SACA reference or the SACA deployment is going to live in this sort of hub VNet where the VDMS subnet lives. You see that there's some VMs I put into that VNet, into that subnet for the diagram that corresponds to specific controls. But really the idea is that the mission owner applications, the actual application owners that have some sort of web application or whatever application it is, they all fall in line behind this, connecting up to the hub through a VNet peer and having user-defined routes that force all traffic through these appliances. And inside that application space, you can absolutely use ASE. You could use service endpoints to use our PaaS SQL database. And now you can take many mission owner applications and connect it and all be compliant behind this one security stack.
Awesome. Okay. So we see the diagram here. What does a typical deployment look like? Yeah,
so the typical deployment we see across the Department of Defense is they'll typically take in this purple box you see, we call it the DISA BCAP. That is a DISA owned, essentially a service that they offer to provide your boundary cap. Typically, people actually use that DISA boundary cap on premises, and the reason for that is because to connect to our PaaS services traditionally, or our software as a service offerings that would connect over a Microsoft peer, those would terminate on that boundary cap, and it would be able to be used for that, as well as connecting over a private express route directly to the IaaS environment that your Azure stuff's going to run in.
Great.
And so they'll usually do connect that over 2 different express route locations, one on the East Coast, one in the more central United States, to connect to these boundary caps. And then they will deploy their VDSS functionality that you saw in that hub VNet that we were showing earlier, and their VDMS, they'll deploy that in sort of a hub in 2 different regions, both the DoD East and DoD Central. And then they will deploy their mission owner applications behind that, and however they can deploy as many mission owner applications behind these stacks as they'd like. But that enables them to have applications that live closer to the user in DoD Central and or the East Coast, as well as some high availability. If one goes down, we can reroute traffic over the other, and that's really scalable and resilient design architecture.
Okay, so we've seen a typical deployment. Who typically deploys these?
Yeah, so the customers that should be looking to deploy this is every single DoD customer that wants to connect to the cloud needs to have this policy met. There are offerings through DISA to just subscribe to their all-up service. But if it's a customer that's going to be sort of a managed service provider for a bunch of different mission owner applications that maybe today host a bunch of different applications in a data center, sort of a centralized enterprise environment for their DoD customers, they would probably be doing the same thing in the cloud. If they look to do that, then it makes sense for them to deploy this template and manage the SACA architecture on their own, get more bang for their buck as more control over their applications. As well as really anybody that wants to be able to deploy DMZ architecture in a more expedient and quicker way. I mean, just a straight up quicker way. It doesn't matter if they're a commercial customer or a DoD customer. One of the things that we did with our version 2 is we scaled the automation back one layer. So before, on our version 1, we were including in the automation the configurations of the actual appliances themselves to meet the policy. What we've done is we scaled that back so that the appliances don't get configured for the policy right out of the gate or included in the automation template. Now you can tag a URI to go to a secondary script that will actually deploy that template. So you can have your SCCA baseline template deployment that tags into this automation and meets all that policy. But if you're a commercial company that does some sort of retail and you have your own security policies that you would want to do, you can create your own security policy script that gets tagged into the deployment and deploys on top of
So other vendors can use it too then?
Yep.
Okay.
So any customer can use it. DoD, we already have an SCCA baseline created for you.
Okay. All right, great.
So with that, I mentioned that we had automated template deployments. So right now we have three automated template deployment options. One of them is using F5 at the core for the network virtual appliances, and with F5 we've got a one-tiered architecture, which is what I showed in the diagram. Essentially just a HA pair of F5s in the core of this architecture. We've also got what we call the three-tier architecture, which takes a couple different F5s, two HA pairs on the top, another layer of them in the bottom, and then put like an IPS in between them to enable that SSL decryption in between and see the clear text traffic. And then we've sort of did the same thing with Citrix, partnered with them as well, and then they've created a three-tiered automated deployment template as well. Although those are our automated deployment options, the reference architecture itself really stays the same across any network virtual appliance vendor you'd like to bring in. So you can sort of take this design and drop in whatever appliance you'd like.
Right.
We just don't necessarily have the automated full up.
Okay.
For those.
All right, this sounds great. So let's see a demo here. Let's see what one of these deployments looks like.
Yeah, let's do it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to actually start off how I suggest to actually start this deployment off. So first place we usually start is we started our public documentation on this architecture. If you actually scroll down, and then this gives you all kinds of really interesting information, dives into the security controls. But really at the bottom, we have our automated deployment options. You see we have our Citrix deployment. It gives a little diagram for specifically what Citrix is doing. Then we've got our F5 deployment here. We're going to quickly demo the F5 one. So you essentially click on this GitHub link. It will take you to the F5 documentation. And here it just goes into GitHub. These where all these scripts are deployed. They've got their README, all their documentation about it.
Plenty of documentation.
Plenty of documentation. So now you'll get down here to the actual template deployments. And so right now we're going to deploy the one-tier deployment on Azure Government. As you can see, we've also got the Azure Commercial deployment buttons, so you can deploy these in any of our clouds that you want to deploy it into. So we'll go ahead and click on the deploy to Azure Government. And this will take you and log you into our Azure Government portal, and this will show you the template here. So in here we've got a bunch of parameters that you can pass. You can bring your own values. We have default values. And I'll take you real quick into what this would look like. So you can go in here and you can actually edit the parameters. So again, it's all open source essentially. It lives in GitHub. You can go in and modify it for your specific needs. But this is essentially what it looks like on the back end. We've got different variables, passing settings, parameters, and you can take that and...
So we've set up the big JSON file for you, but you can just come in and fill out a bunch of values in text boxes here and deploy it into your subscription. It's as easy as that.
So now you saw that you can actually edit these parameters through the JSON file. So the first thing you would do is you essentially just need to create a resource group. I'm going to call this the demo resource group. Again, this is your location. This is your actual Azure regions. If you have access to the DoD East regions or Central, as well as the U.S. government regions, you can deploy this into those regions. If you had selected the commercial little deployment button, you'd be logged in the commercial and you'd see all the commercial regions. So we're going to deploy this in DoD East. You'll see that there's some default values passed, and then we've got a couple just a couple little boxes that have little red stars with them. Those are required fields. These are admin passwords for your jump boxes and your F5s. I'm just going to go ahead and paste the password in here real quick. So when you first log in, your default admin username would be whatever you select, but in the default that we provide for you is xadmin, and then whatever password you supply. And then you'll need a license key. So here we got the license key. I'll go ahead and paste the license key in there. These are going to be licensing your F5 appliances. In this one-tier architecture, there's 2 appliances, so you need 2 license keys. So second key is going to be popped in here. So this is my second license key. This is their best, highest level license key that includes all their features. And that's all you actually need to actually do in this template. Nice. There's just provide a password and provide a couple license keys. Agree to the terms and conditions and hit purchase.
Okay.
So now this is actually going to start running here in the background, and for the purpose of this demo, I've already got one that's been created. So at the end, this is what it's going to look like. So if you see here, this is a deployment that I did earlier, and took 12 minutes and 45 seconds to deploy this architecture and created all these different resources. I'll tell you what they are, but you see it created a bunch of different resources. And now I'll actually go to the resource group that you can see where this was deployed to. So here, first we'll go to this is the actual resource group that we created in the demo. This is the demo one. I call this one SACA v2. This has your availability set that your VMs are going to be deployed into for high availability. And then the different network interfaces. So these are, as you can see here, these are the F5 appliances, external interfaces, comes deployed with 3 interfaces per appliance. The external Azure load balancer that's going to sit in front of that and be able to connect to that and load balance across those VMs. The actual VMs themselves, so if you actually filter this, it'll be a little easier. So you'll see all these network interfaces created, network security group that uses for access control, as well as the actual VMs themselves. So you see you've got 2 F5 VMs that are deployed in the core, and a Linux jump box and a Windows machine that you can use to RDP into as well. And then from those boxes, you'll be able to actually jump into your F5s or whatever else you want to be able to manage in the environment. The cool part is that the first second you log into these devices, into these jump boxes, it's already passing through the security stack through the F5s and meeting those security policies. So it's already meeting the controls out of the box.
Excellent.
The most important thing that I think is deployed with this deployment is the route table that gets created. This is where it's going to attach to any subnet that you're going to have an application living. This route table you would just now need to associate it with any subnet you create for your applications, which is going to force that traffic through the F5s. And so we already create that for you and sort of pre-stage it. So you'll see that we have sort of a default route that would anything that doesn't live in Azure, it's going to force it to the backside of that F5s. And then we've got to our management subnet and to the VDMS subnet that was created, same thing. So now anything that's in there is going to route through those F5s, and you don't have to worry about it. That's sort of an area that as customers deploy images out of Marketplace and want to force tunnel through them, we see a lot of confusion around how you set that up. We set that up for you.
Yeah, and that's a huge point because not only does this template make it super easy to do your initial setup, but then when you're adding new machines, whether it's a Marketplace image or I'm provisioning a new VM or whatever, you're provisioning those resources into this secure environment that's already been established.
Yep, exactly.
Okay,
so,
great.
And sort of just show some proof here that we're getting what we advertise here. I'll go ahead and show you the sort of the network diagram that gets created by default in Azure. So if you actually go into the virtual network and you select this diagram here, it's going to pull up a diagram that Azure essentially makes for you. So if you see here, you've got your VNet at the top, your different subnets, VDMS subnet, management subnet, internal side of your F5 subnet, and the external side. And this internal route table, you can see if you follow those lines, is actually assigned automatically to the VDMS subnet and the management subnet.
Yeah.
So that'll force that traffic the way we're talking about. And you see these NICs here. For the management subnet, you've got the NICs that actually are for those jump boxes attached to them already, and it shows the VMs that they're attached to. And then the internal side and external side, these are all F5 NICs that are assigned to the load balanced backend VMs, and then the Azure load balancers that live in front of that.
Yeah, that's huge. This diagram is great because before we're just looking at a list of resources, but this actually gives you the diagram that matches the diagram you were showing us in the beginning to kind of prove, yes, this is where all this stuff has been provisioned, so to speak.
Yeah, so
great.
that's essentially it. So I mean, it took 12 minutes and 45 seconds to get this deployment done. Now, for the VDMS controls, you'll have to bring a lot of things on your own. That's an area where you can bring third-party tools or open source tools that you may want to deploy to meet some of the log aggregation, things like that. But you can also use a lot of our Azure services. As more and more services come in IL5, that opens up the opportunity for DoD to use some more of those services. I mentioned Azure Monitor before, but things like going forward, Azure Sentinel might be a great option if that comes into the DoD cloud.
Okay.
We can actually use something like that, and that would sort of sit, even though it's a patch service, it wouldn't sit in the VDMS subnet, but that could be used to meet the VDMS controls. And I mentioned earlier that if you're a commercial customer that doesn't have to adhere to the DoD policies, and it's Azure Sentinel something you want to use in conjunction with this template, you can absolutely do that in the commercial regions.
Okay.
So it's modular. You can modify it. You can do anything you want to do with it, but this is going to get your core enterprise security architecture stood up in about 12 minutes and 45 seconds.
Great. All right, so any other thing that viewers should know to get started, or is it really just going to the documentation page where the GitHub template lives?
Yeah, I would just say just get to the documentation page. The short URL for it is aka.ms/SACA. I'm sure we'll tag it on the video here for you. And then from there, you can kind of jump into anything you want from there. We talk on that document about the different Azure services that can be used, and that they have links to those documentation. And then if you want to go to the automated deployments from the two vendors that we mentioned, you can go to their documentation out of there and just sort of jump off from there and start going down the rabbit hole. It's all open for you to start doing it today.
Okay, great. All right. This has been Steve Michelotti with Jason Henderson talking about the secure Azure computing architecture for the DoD on Azure Government. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.